history than historical reconstruction, then really and truly, there's no more quest. To conclude, to my mind, the value of memory theory is to conclude, the value of memory theory to historical Jesus research is really a disvalue. It does not refine our previous positivistic criteria, allowing us better to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic Jesus material. Neither does it provide a new route by which to discover authentic Jesus material. Rather, I suggest it pushes us ever further away from certainty, from confidence in assessing authentic material, and in distinguishing it from inauthentic material. Keith and LeDun are abundantly correct. There are two reasons for this. The first is not merely that memory, both individual and group, is not entirely trustworthy, but how commonly it is untrustworthy. But the second is the far more serious, that there is no way to distinguish between accurate and inaccurate memories, or what I have called manufactured memories elsewhere. To my mind, the most troubling implications of memory theory force us back into no-quest territory, and I find this deeply distressing. Because one of the most powerful lines in defense of historical Jesus research that I've ever read is Dom Crossan's line from his three-way debate with Luke Timothy Johnson and Werner Kelber called the Jesus Controversy. He writes, "History is possible because its absence is reprehensible." That is, without confidence in history, in historical reconstruction, anywhere in any period on any issue, there can be no hope for justice. I fear a no quest, but this is where memory theory has pushed me. Some people persist in the naive hope that memory theory supports the reliability of the Gospels. Memory theory, according to Keener, argues that although, quote, memory can be imperfect, there are normally limits to this imperfection, i.e., they do not ordinarily involve free composition of events. Even when some details are inaccurate, the gist is usually accurate, end of quote. But there are simply too many instances involving the, quote, free composition of events, end of quote, and for which gist memory is no more reliable than detailed memory. History and lab tests reveal this repeatedly, and they cannot be ignored. I must reject Keener's hopefulness and conclude that finding the historical Jesus is hopeless. But at the same time, I must be equally clear, I have not devolved into hyper-skepticism, as Dale Allison warns against. My no-quest position derives not from an assumption that human memory is inherently unreliable. Yes, there is much evidence to show that human memory is deeply unreliable in a whole host of ways, but nonetheless, I agree with Daniel Schachter that memory works well most of the time. What pushes me into no-quest territory, I stress, is not that memory is never reliable, but that reliable and unreliable memories are indistinguishable from one another. To the person who holds the memories, and even more seriously, to the outsider analyzing the memories. And as gospel scholars, we are outsiders analyzing other people's memories. Thank you.
Okay, our third speaker is Rafael Rodriguez, an Uneasy Concord, Memory and History in Contemporary Jesus Research.
The early 20th century saw the rise of memory as an analytical category in the practice of critical historiography. Morris Hawwalks coined the term collected memory and located the structure or the framework of memory in social and cultural forces outside the individual. However, the rise of memory emerged from a broader academic plot than Hawwalks and French sociology. To quote Astrid Erl, memory studies was an international and transdisciplinary phenomenon from the very beginning, close quote. After the Second World War, the academic interest in memory waned until the 1980s, when memory studies once again emerged as an international and transdisciplinary phenomenon. As an academic discipline, biblical studies bumped up against the new memory studies periodically throughout the 1990s. However, it was not until the early 2000s that memory studies penetrated biblical scholarship. In 2003, James Dunn's mammoth volume, Jesus Remembered, explicitly highlighted the role of memory and oral oral tradition as the medium of transmission between the historical Jesus and the written Gospels, especially the Synoptics, though Dunn did not engage the burgeoning and interdisciplinary study of memory. 2 years later, Alan Kirk and Tom Thatcher formally and programmatically introduced memory studies to biblical scholarship, first by means of Alan Kirk's précis of social and cultural memory, and second by means of a series of essays exploring the intersection of memory studies and Christian origins. In the 8 years since Kirk and Thatcher's Semaya Studies volume, literally dozens of monographs, dissertations, and articles have been and are being published that take some measure or account of memory studies and apply those studies to the historical and literary questions of biblical studies. The thriving discussion around and application of memory studies has even included the direct contribution of some of the memory theorists in question, including Jeffrey K. Olick, who has an essay in BTB from 2006, and Barry Schwartz, who's published a number of volumes and participated in a number of conferences, including SBL. Memory theory, or better, memory theories, shows every sign of waxing rather than waning among biblical and related research. Now, among all this dynamic activity, we should not be surprised to find considerable disagreement about both the dynamics of memory and its significance for our questions. The most well-known appeals to memory studies for historical scholarship arguably and probably come from conservative quarters. I'm thinking of Bauckham and Keener and some of the people that Zeb noted. But it would be wrong to think that only or even primarily conservative scholars have embraced memory studies. Some of the more prominent advocates of memory theory include April DeClonic, Richard Horsley, Werner Kelber, and Rand Schroeder, none of whom give any indication of harboring a conservative ideological or theological perspective. Others may or may not identify as variously conservative or traditional scholars, but their use of memory studies has not been overtly or even subtly apologetically motivated, and I would include my own work here, of course. As with any new field of inquiry, the discussion is diverse and pulls in multiple and sometimes conflicting directions. However, the use of memory studies among biblical studies has reached critical mass, and among biblical scholars, the discussion of memory is most dynamic among historians of ancient Israel and the historical Jesus. By the end of 2013, the question for historians of Jesus has shifted from, is memory relevant for historical Jesus research, to how does memory affect historical Jesus research, despite protests to the contrary. In an attempt to answer this latter question, I will argue that memory studies poses significant challenges to the traditional task of historical Jesus research, even as it offers suggestive ways forward. Now I want to pause for just a second and warn you that my paper is going to echo and in two places quote the very same passages that we've already heard. My paper is more similar, of course, to Chris Keats than to Zeb's. The fact that the program book has Chris going before me should not obscure the fact that there is a charge of plagiarism on the table.
Again.
First, I'd like to describe the traditional Jesus historiography. For all the debate over how to isolate and identify historical information about Jesus, historians generally agree about the basic nature of the problem facing them. Robert Miller, in his introduction to the debate over whether Jesus shared an apocalyptic worldview, offers a clear formulation of the problem, and I'll quote Miller at length. Quote, all critical scholars agree that the Gospels contain both historically reliable material based on memories about Jesus and historically unreliable material based on his followers' interpretations of his life, death, and teaching. The task of historical criticism is to analyze this complex blend of memory and interpretation in order to distinguish what should be attributed to the historical Jesus and what should be attributed either to progressive elaboration by the rank and file of early Christians who passed on the stories about him, or the focused creativity of the individual gospel writers, close quote. Key there is complex blend. John Meyer, whose approach to an understanding of Jesus differs markedly from Bob Miller, shares this basic perspective. In 1991, he set out on a massive quest to isolate the historically authentic material from later interpretive editions, and as he would describe it 3 years later, quote, as much as possible to let any overarching interpretation of Jesus and his work emerge gradually and naturally out of the convergence of the data judged historical, close quote. Despite developments in the historical study of Jesus since Meyer published the first volume of A Marginal Jew, Meyer has not adjusted or updated his approach to Jesus' historiography in light of the developments. And here I would point you to the section at the beginning of Volume 4 of A Marginal Jew, copyrighted 2009, so 18 years after the first volume. Once again, a reminder about the rules of the road, where Meyer just recapitulates the same rules he's been doing for 18 years. This is the stability of his method, despite the way the field has moved. But even more creative historians, who do not content themselves with playing the same game only better, and who spend considerable time and energy and even ink thinking about the game itself, end up offering criteria designed to assist in the task of differentiating historical from interpretive tradition. For example, rather than jettisoning the criterion of double dissimilarity, which does not at all serve his historiographical interests, N.T. Wright couples it with a criterion of double similarity. Similarly, James Dunn offers a broad brush criterion that precedes his analysis of any of the Jesus tradition's particular detail. Quote, any feature which is characteristic within the Jesus tradition and relatively distinctive of the Jesus tradition is most likely to go back to Jesus. That is, to reflect the original impact made by Jesus' teaching and actions on several, at least, of his first disciples, close quote. Unlike Meyer, neither Wright nor Dunn set out simply to differentiate authentic from inauthentic traditions. However, the rhetoric and logic of criteria, which were designed for the more traditional tasks of sifting and lifting authentic traditions from their context in the Gospels, continues to exert its influence over Wright's and Dunn's more holistic analyses of the Jesus tradition. And despite that sweeping generalization in Robert Miller's claim that all critical scholars agree, these are his words, all critical scholars agree, despite that sweeping generalization, some critical scholars have exhibited considerable discomfort at this way of thinking about our sources and our historiographical task. Already in 1998, Dale Allison sensed that the primary task facing historians of Jesus was not the isolation and identification of authentic tradition amidst their interpretive overlays. Allison spent considerable energy attempting to demonstrate, quote, how facile is the usual assumption that a complex either originated with Jesus or with the church, close quote. He was similarly aware that the traditional criteria of authenticity did not actually enable the historian to differentiate authentic from inauthentic tradition. He did not, however, see any other way to speak about Jesus without the criteria, so he resigned himself to use them, even if critically. Over the ensuing decade, Allison only grew more disenchanted with the criteria. He also formulated a different approach to the question of the historical Jesus, one that depended heavily on memory studies. Now, this point requires emphasis. Allison did not appeal to memory studies as a new method for playing an old game. Although I liked your metaphor, I just think it's wrong. Allison sought to rewrite the rules and the goals of the game itself. Memory was not for Allison a safeguard or a guarantor of the reliability of the Jesus tradition. Rather, memory restructured Allison's conception of the Jesus tradition. That is, what he thought that tradition was, and it changed the way he worked with it to develop knowledge about Jesus. And this is where I think your analogy falls apart. The goal is still the same, knowledge about Jesus. So, if that's the traditional Jesus historiography, I want to think for a minute about Jesus in early Christian memory. In the space that remains, I want to look at a number of ideas that are emerging out of the current discussion. Taken together, these ideas do not move the old discussion forward, either by tilting the balance in favor of the gospel's reliability, Pace Bacchum, or by casting that